The tavern door, a slab of iron-hinged oak, groaned open like a beast disturbed from slumber, its screech a familiar overture to the symphony of chaos within. Rain, or the memory of it, slicked the cobblestones of the unnamed medieval English town, the air thick with the commingled fug of wood smoke, damp wool, horse, and something vaguely soupy from a nearby vendor's stall. For Elias Thorne, a man more accustomed to the hushed archives of Oxford than the rowdy clamour of a common alehouse, the sensory assault was, as always, both repellent and strangely invigorating. How many untold stories, Elias wondered, lay fermenting in the dregs of these ale-soaked establishments, dismissed as drunken ramblings, yet holding perhaps a kernel of forgotten truth. Elias, in his early 40s, possessed the lean, slightly stooped build of a scholar, his tweed jacket out of place amidst the leather jerkins and rough-spun tunics. His dark hair, usually neatly combed, was damp and unruly from the drizzle, and his grey eyes, sharp with an intelligence that often saw patterns others missed, scanned the crowded, smoky interior. He wasn't here for the ale, though the damp chill in his bones certainly argued for it. He was here for the whispers, the fragments of lore that clung to such places like ancient cobwebs. His current obsession, one that had earned him polite smiles and quiet derision from his more conventional colleagues, was the pursuit of what he termed folk cartography, the idea that pre-literate societies encoded vast geographical and astronomical knowledge into orally transmitted myths, songs, and even the seemingly random layouts of their settlements or sacred sites. He found a precarious seat on a lopsided bench near the hearth, the wood still damp with some unidentifiable spillage. The air was a potent brew, sour ale, stale sweat, roasting meat of dubious origin, and the ever-present tang of wood smoke that never quite found its way up the soot-stained chimney. A farmer nearby, red-faced and already 3 ales deep, was loudly recounting a tale involving a sideways-born calf and a surprisingly astute pig. A bard in the corner, his lute missing 2 strings, warbled a ballad about a knight who'd mistaken a badger for a dragon. Standard tavern fare. Yet Elias listened intently, not just to the words, but to the cadence, the recurring motifs, the geographical landmarks that, however distorted, might betray an older underlying map of the land and its sacred meanings. His adversary in this intellectual pursuit was not a person, but a prevailing academic mindset, personified perhaps by Professor Alaric Finchley of Cambridge, a man Elias had never met, but whose dismissive papers on the romantic fallacies of oral tradition were legendary. Finchley championed the written word, the verifiable artifact, the excavated ruin. To him, folklore was mere fancy, the illiterate peasant's substitute for history. Elias, however, believed that before the written word there was the spoken map, the sung star chart, the danced ritual that encoded a people's relationship with their cosmos. He'd found tantalizing hints of it in Welsh triads, in Irish imrama, even in the seemingly nonsensical nursery rhymes that had somehow survived centuries. His current focus was a local legend, a garbled tale of a sleeping giant or earth king, said to lie buried beneath the chalk hills of southern England, a giant whose slumber shaped the rivers and whose dreams brought fertility to the land. Most folklorists dismissed it as a typical etiological myth. But Elias, having studied early Ordnance Survey maps and even some daringly speculative alignments proposed by amateur antiquarians, suspected something more. He believed the legend might be a folk memory of a vast Neolithic earthwork complex, perhaps a Cursis monument or a series of interconnected long barrows, its original purpose and astronomical alignments forgotten, but its immense presence somehow encoded into the landscape's psychic memory. A serving wench, sharp-eyed and unimpressed by his scholarly demeanour, slammed a pewter tankard of ale before him. Elias paid her, his fingers fumbling with the unfamiliar coinage. He took a cautious sip. It was warm, bitter, and undeniably potent. "You're not from around here, master?" the wench, whose name he later learned was Meg, observed, wiping her hands on a stained apron. "No," Elias admitted. "I'm a traveller, a seeker of old tales." Meg snorted. "Plenty o' them are, mostly lies spun by drunkards. Pay 'em no mind." She gestured towards the bard. "Like yon Tom o' Bedlam, sings of stars falling into rivers and hills that walk. Mad as a March hare he is." Stars falling into rivers, hills that walk. Elias's interest sharpened. These were the kinds of bizarre, poetic images that sometimes concealed deeper, older meanings. He made a mental note to speak with Tom O'Bedlam, mad or not. His quest for the sleeping giant had led him to this particular region because of a recurring motif in the local versions of the legend, a specific configuration of 7 stars, often called the herdsman's hounds or the king's jewels, which were said to mark the giant's resting head. The Pleiades, Elias suspected, a star cluster whose heliacal rising held agricultural significance for many ancient cultures. If he could find a landscape feature, a forgotten earthwork, aligned to the Pleiades in a way that matched the local lore, it would be a significant breakthrough. The tavern door creaked open again, admitting a blast of damp air and a man built like a weathered oak, his face a roadmap of wrinkles. His eyes, though, surprisingly bright and alert. He was an old shepherd, Willem, known for his knowledge of the downs and their hidden paths. Elias had been hoping to encounter him. Later, fortified by another ale and a surprisingly edible pottage of barley and rabbit, Elias approached Willem. The old shepherd was initially reticent, wary of an outsider asking strange questions about the hills. But Elias's genuine respect for local knowledge and his ability to listen without condescension gradually won him over. "The giant." "Aye," Willem said, his voice a low rumble. "My grandfer used to say you don't walk on the giant, you walk with him. His breath is the mist in the coombs, his bones are the chalk underfoot." He paused, taking a long pull from his tankard. "And the 7 stars, they do indeed watch over his head. There's a place, high on Windover Hill, they call the Star Mark, a circle of old stones, mostly fallen now or buried. From there, on certain nights, the hounds seem to sit right atop the giant's brow, which is the long barrow they call the King's Rest. A circle of old stones, a long barrow. Alignments." Elias felt the familiar thrill of connection, the sense of disparate threads beginning to weave into a coherent pattern. This was more than just folklore. This was folk cartography. The landscape itself was the map. The stories were the key. Professor Finchley, with his insistence on textual proof, would scoff. But Elias knew, with a certainty that resonated deeper than academic argument, that he was on the verge of something profound. The sleeping giant of the South Downs was beginning to stir in his imagination, and perhaps in the collective, ancient memory of the land itself. The following dawn, Elias, guided by Willem, found himself climbing the steep flank of Windover Hill. The mist still clung to the lower slopes, giving the landscape an ethereal, timeless quality. The air was cold and clean, smelling of wet chalk and sheep. Willem moved with an agility that belied his years, his hobnailed boots finding purchase on the slick turf as if he were an extension of the hill itself. "The Star Mark," Willem said, pointing to a subtle, almost circular depression on the brow of the hill, dotted with a few sarsens, grey and weathered, half submerged in the earth. "Not much to look at now. The old folk say it was a proper circle once, tall stones. But time, and men looking for gateposts, have had their way." Elias surveyed the site. It was undeniably ancient. The remaining stones, though few, suggested a deliberate placement. He pulled out his compass and a detailed ordnance survey map, on which he had already marked the King's Rest Long Barrow, a prominent Neolithic mound on a ridge several miles to the east. He took careful readings, his mind racing. If Willem was right, and if the herdsman's hounds, the Pleiades, aligned with the King's Rest from this vantage point, a specific time of year. He spent the rest of the day meticulously surveying the Star Mark and its surroundings, using a portable theodolite he'd brought. He found faint traces of an encircling ditch, almost entirely silted up, and what might have been a deliberately levelled platform within the circle. Willem watched him, a mixture of curiosity and amusement in his eyes. "You see more in these old stones than most, Master." "Perhaps they have more to tell than most are willing to hear," Elias murmured, scribbling notes. That evening, back in his modest lodgings at the village inn, a slightly more salubrious establishment than the previous night's tavern, though not by much, Elias worked late into the night. He fed his survey data into his laptop, running archaeo-astronomical software to calculate the rising and setting points of the Pleiades as they would have appeared from Windover Hill during the Neolithic period, roughly 3500 to 2500 BCE, the likely era of Long Barrow construction. The results, when they finally appeared on the screen, made him catch his breath. Around 3000 BCE, From the precise centre of the star-marked circle, the Pleiades would have risen directly over the King's Rest Long Barrow at the time of the spring equinox. It was a perfect alignment, too precise to be coincidental. The herdsman's hounds watching over the giant's head. The folklore was not just a charming tale. It was an accurate astronomical and geographical observation, preserved for 5 millennia in oral tradition. This was the kind of evidence that could begin to challenge Finchley's dogma. It wasn't just about one alignment. It was about the convergence of landscape features, astronomical events, and enduring folklore, all pointing to a sophisticated, integrated world view among the Neolithic inhabitants of these hills. They weren't just burying their dead in long barrows. They were orienting their sacred sites to the cosmos, encoding that knowledge into the very fabric of the land, and it seemed, into the stories they told about it. His next step was to investigate the King's Rest Long Barrow itself more closely. Local antiquarian records, some dating back to the 18th century, spoke of unauthorized digs that had yielded human remains, pottery shards, and flint tools, but little in the way of detailed survey or understanding of its construction or orientation. Elias suspected that the barrow, like many Neolithic monuments, might itself be aligned to other celestial events or landscape features, forming part of a larger sacred geography. He spent several days at the King's Rest, a massive earthen mound, now grassed over, its silhouette stark against the sky. It was indeed aligned roughly east-west, its entrance, or what seemed to be its original entrance facade, facing the midwinter sunrise. But there was something else, a subtle feature that previous antiquarians had overlooked or misinterpreted. A series of very low, almost imperceptible earthwork rays, or shallow ditches extending outwards from the eastern end of the barrow, like the spokes of a wheel, or perhaps, Elias thought with a shiver, the stylized representation of a many-rayed solar disk. Or a 7-rayed star, the Pleiades again. The symbolism was becoming almost overwhelming. He knew he needed more than just surface observations and astronomical calculations. He needed to see beneath the earth. He had no license for excavation, nor the resources for it. But perhaps non-invasive geophysics, he thought of his colleague, Dr. Aris Thorne, the geophysicist who had helped him with the groundbreaking, or rather water-breaking, sonar survey of the Abu Rawash Water Guardian in Egypt. Thorne, with his maverick spirit and cutting-edge equipment, might be intrigued by this English enigma. The challenge would be convincing Thorne to divert his resources to what many would see as a far less glamorous, far more speculative project than a colossal submerged Egyptian sphinx. But Elias believed the potential implications were just as profound. To reveal a hidden layer of sophisticated Neolithic cosmology woven into the familiar landscape of southern England, a testament to an ancient intellectual tradition that had been dismissed and forgotten. He began to draft an email to Thorne, outlining his findings: the Windover Hill alignment, the King's Rest orientation, the suggestive earthwork rays, all underpinned by the persistent local folklore of the sleeping giant and the 7 stars. He attached his preliminary calculations and sketches. He knew Finchley and his ilk would ridicule such a synthesis of hard archaeoastronomy with soft folklore. But Elias was no longer daunted by such criticism. He was following the whispers, and they were leading him somewhere extraordinary. The sleeping giant was not just a feature of the landscape. He was a library of ancient knowledge, and Elias was determined to learn how to read his language. Aris Thorne's response was surprisingly swift and enthusiastic. The Abu Rawash discovery had given him a taste for archaeological puzzles that challenged conventional timelines, and the blend of folklore and potential archaeoastronomy in Elias's English enigma intrigued him. Neolithic Brits playing with stars and chalk giants, Thorne? His email read, characteristically irreverent. Sounds like a pleasant change from Nile mud. I've got a new lightweight resistivity meter and a gradiometer that are itching for a workout. If you can sort out the permissions for a non-invasive survey, I'm in. Securing permissions, even for a non-invasive survey on what was mostly privately owned agricultural land around the King's Rest Barrow and Windover Hill, was a bureaucratic labyrinth. It involved navigating English heritage regulations, negotiating with local landowners, some intrigued, some deeply suspicious of academics poking around their fields, and carefully wording his research proposal to avoid sounding too much like a delver into ley lines and druidic fancy, which would have invited immediate dismissal from the more conservative elements of the archaeological establishment. He focused on the potential for clarifying the construction phases of the Long Barrow and identifying previously unrecorded ancillary structures, with the archaeo-astronomical and folkloric aspects presented as secondary, contextual lines of inquiry. It took months, but finally the permissions were granted. Aris arrived with his van packed with gleaming equipment, his energy a stark contrast to Elias's more contemplative demeanour. Together with a couple of eager archaeology postgraduates from a local university, who saw Elias Thorne as something of an iconoclast hero after Abu Rawash, they set up their survey grids. The resistivity survey over the King's Rest Long Barrow was the first to yield results. Beneath the smooth, grassed-over mound, the meter began to paint a picture of complex internal structures, chambers, passages, and, most excitingly, clear evidence of the shallow, radiating ditches Elias had suspected at the eastern end. There were indeed 7 of them, fanning out like the rays of a stylized star or the legs of an immense, buried insect. 7 rays, Thorne, 7! Aris exclaimed, looking at the processed data on his field laptop. Just like your Pleiades folklore. Coincidence? I'm starting to think your sleeping giant has been trying to tell us something rather specific. The gradiometer survey around the star mark on Windover Hill was even more revealing. It confirmed the silted-up encircling ditch and the levelled internal platform, but it also detected a series of post holes within the circle, arranged in a complex pattern that suggested not just a simple ring of standing stones, but perhaps a more elaborate timber structure or a series of precisely placed marker posts. And crucially, it identified a narrow, ditched avenue or processional way leading directly from the star mark eastwards in the exact direction of the King's Rest Long Barrow, an alignment that would have perfectly framed the rising Pleiades over the barrow in the Neolithic spring. The evidence was accumulating, piece by painstaking piece. This wasn't just a collection of isolated monuments. It was an interconnected sacred landscape, deliberately designed and oriented to reflect and interact with celestial cycles, its meaning preserved, however imperfectly, in the enduring local folklore. During their survey, Elias made a point of spending more time with Willem, the old shepherd, and with Meg, the sharp-witted tavern wench, and even sought out Tom O'Bedlam, the mad bard. He listened not just for direct corroboration of his theories, but for the nuances of language, the recurring symbols, the seemingly irrelevant details that might hold a fragment of older understanding. Tom O'Bedlam, it turned out, was not so much mad as possessed of a poet's heightened sensitivity and a vast, jumbled repository of local lore, songs, and snippets of near-forgotten history. When Elias asked him about hills that walk, Tom's eyes lit up. "Aye, master! The old ones say the hills were alive once, that they'd shift and turn to greet the sun and stars. They say the giant under the downs, he just turned over in his sleep one day, and that's how the Cuckmere River found its new valley." A fanciful tale, certainly, but one that resonated with the idea of a landscape imbued with agency, a landscape that actively participated in cosmic events. Meg, surprisingly, contributed a piece of the puzzle too. When Elias mentioned the 7 radiating ditches at the King's Rest, she frowned in thought. 7. My gran used to have a charm for luck in childbirth, she said. It was 7 white pebbles, arranged like a star. She called it the mother's handful. Said it came down from the old times, from the fairy folk who lived in the barrows. The mother's handful. 7 stars. The Pleiades, often associated with mother goddesses and fertility in ancient mythologies. Another thread, delicate but distinct. Elias began to see the sleeping giant not as a single entity, but as a vast sprawling ideogram writ large upon the land, a complex tapestry of earthworks, stone circles, alignments and stories, all designed to mediate between the human community and the cosmos, to ensure the harmonious flow of seasons, the fertility of the land and the continuity of life. Professor Finchley would have dismissed it all as undisciplined speculation, a romantic projection onto a mute landscape. But Elias, standing on Windover Hill as the setting sun painted the chalk downs in hues of rose and amber, felt a profound connection to the Neolithic minds that had conceived and constructed this sacred space. They hadn't been primitive savages, grunting in the darkness. They had been astronomers, engineers, poets of the earth, their university the sky, their library the land itself. The culmination of their fieldwork was the decision to conduct a small, targeted excavation, not of the main barrow, which would require years and immense resources, but of one of the newly discovered post holes within the star-marked circle on Windover Hill. The permissions for this were even harder to obtain, but the compelling geophysical data, coupled with Elias's growing reputation, finally swayed the authorities. The excavation was modest, a carefully dug trench revealing a deep, well-defined post hole, and at its base, preserved in the anaerobic chalky soil, they found it. A small, worked flint scraper, and more importantly, a fragment of deer antler, likely from a pick used to dig the hole. These could be carbon dated. The C-14 results, when they came back weeks later, were electrifying. The antler fragment dated to approximately 3200 BCE, plus by another 150 years. Directly within the time frame Elias had predicted for the Pleiades alignment over the King's Rest. It was the crucial, datable link between the astronomical alignment, the folklore, and the physical construction of the sacred site. Elias knew he now had a powerful, multi-layered case to present, one that even Finchley would find difficult to dismiss out of hand. He began to write, not just a dry academic paper, but a narrative that wove together the geophysics, the archaeoastronomy, the excavation results, and the rich, enduring tapestry of local folklore. He would call it The Sleeping Giant Awakens, Celestial Alignments, Sacred Landscapes, and Folk Memory in Neolithic Sussex. The whispers of the land, it turned out, had a very precise and ancient story to tell. And Elias Thorne, the seeker of old tales, had finally learned enough of their language to begin translating it for a world that had long forgotten how to listen. The publication of The Sleeping Giant Awakens in a leading archaeological journal sent ripples, rather than shockwaves, through the academic community. Unlike the immediate global sensation of the Abu Rawash Water Guardian, the implications of the Sussex findings were more nuanced, requiring a deeper understanding of Neolithic cosmology and the subtle interplay of landscape, myth, and archaeoastronomy. Yet, among specialists in European prehistory, the paper was recognized as a landmark study. Elias's meticulous integration of geophysical surveys, precise astronomical calculations, datable excavated material, and carefully documented folklore presented a compelling model for re-evaluating countless other enigmatic prehistoric sites. Professor Alaric Finchley, as Elias had anticipated, remained publicly silent on the Sussex paper, likely deeming it outside his Egyptological domain. However, Elias heard through the academic grapevine that Finchley had, with uncharacteristic humility, cited Elias's interdisciplinary approach in a closed seminar on reassessing anomalous data in established chronologies. It was a small, indirect acknowledgement, but for Elias it felt like a significant thawing of the intellectual ice. The real impact, however, was local. The communities around Windover Hill and the King's Rest suddenly saw their familiar landscape with new eyes. The sleeping giant was no longer just a quaint tale for tourists, it was a profound testament to the wisdom of their ancestors. Willem, the old shepherd, became something of a local celebrity, sought out by journalists and amateur historians, his quiet dignity and deep knowledge of the Downs finally receiving wider recognition. Meg, the tavern wench, even started offering a special giant's ale, regaling patrons with her grand tales of the mother's handful. Tom O'Bedlam's mad songs about walking hills and star-crossed rivers were suddenly reinterpreted as garbled echoes of ancient cosmic truths. Elias, with Aris Thorne's continued collaboration, established a small non-profit research trust, the Landscape and Law Project, dedicated to the interdisciplinary study of similar sites across Britain. They received modest grants, enough to continue their fieldwork, train young researchers, and work with local communities to preserve and interpret their unique heritage. Their approach was always one of partnership, valuing traditional knowledge as highly as scientific data. The King's Rest Long Barrow and the Windover Hill Star Mark were eventually given enhanced heritage protection, with new, sensitive interpretation panels explaining their Neolithic significance, and their connection to the celestial cycles and the enduring folklore of the sleeping giant. The site became a place of quiet pilgrimage, not for occultists seeking mystical energies, but for those who wished to connect with a deeper, more ancient understanding of the British landscape. Ilara's mind momentarily drifted to her Egyptian colleague and friend as she stood on Windover Hill one crisp autumn morning, the Sussex Downs spread out before her in a tapestry of bronze and gold. She thought of Ilara's parallel journey at Abu Rawash, of the immense water guardian stirring from its millennia of slumber. 2 different continents, 2 vastly different cultures, yet the same underlying human impulse, to make sense of the cosmos, to mark the land with sacred meaning, to weave stories that connected the human to the divine, the earth to the stars. Perhaps, Elias mused, his folk cartography and Ilara's pursuit of submerged monuments were not so different. Both were about listening to the earth's oldest voices. He received an email from Ilara Vance not long after. She had read his Sussex paper with great interest. "Remarkable convergences, Elias," she wrote. "The Pleiades alignments, the 7-fold symbolism, the deep connection between landscape, astronomy, and foundational myths. It seems our first people, whether in the Nile Valley or on the South Downs, were asking very similar questions and perhaps finding remarkably similar answers expressed in their own unique cultural languages. Perhaps there's a Rosetta Stone of deep human symbolic thought still waiting to be discovered, not in a single artifact, but in the comparative patterns across these ancient sacred landscapes worldwide." Her words resonated deeply. A Rosetta Stone of symbolic thought. It was a breathtaking concept. The work was far from over. It was, Elias realized, a lifetime's journey, a quest that stretched across continents and millennia. The sleeping giant of Sussex had awakened, not to walk the hills as Tom o' Bedlam sang, but to reveal the profound intellectual and spiritual landscape of its creators. And in doing so, it had awakened something in Elias too, a renewed sense of purpose, a deeper understanding of the enduring human need to find our place within the vast, silent symphony of the cosmos. He looked towards the King's Rest, its ancient mound a dark silhouette against the pale autumn sky. The herdsman's hounds, the Pleiades, would soon begin their winter ascent, and the giant, their earthly counterpart, would continue his slumber, his secrets now a little less hidden, his ancient wisdom beginning, once more, to inform the present. The tavern tales, the shepherd's knowledge, the bard's mad songs, they were all part of it, fragments of a vast, interconnected story, a story that Elias Thorne, the quiet scholar, was finally helping the world to read. The true maps, he now knew, were not just lines on parchment, but patterns in the stars, contours in the land, and the enduring, resilient whispers of human memory. The success of The Sleeping Giant Awakens led to unexpected opportunities. Elias found himself invited to consult on other projects, sites where intriguing folklore hinted at deeper, unacknowledged archaeological significance. He travelled to Brittany, examining the complex alignments of the Karnak stones, and to Orkney, where the Neolithic ritual landscapes of Skara Brae and Maeshowe seemed to echo similar celestial concerns. With each site, the patterns Ilara Vance had mentioned, the convergences, became more apparent. The Pleiades, Sirius, Orion, solstitial and equinoctial alignments, sacred numbers like 7 and 9, foundation myths involving sky beings and earth shapers. These weren't identical, but the underlying grammar of sacred geography felt strikingly familiar. Professor Finchley, meanwhile, had published a cautious but significant reappraisal of certain predynastic Nubian sites, acknowledging previously overlooked astronomical orientations and citing, with a surprising lack of his usual condescension, the methodological approaches used by Thorne and others in the Sussex research. Professor Finchley, meanwhile, had published a cautious but significant reappraisal of certain predynastic Nubian sites, acknowledging previously overlooked astronomical orientations and citing with a Morthlilm. It was, for Finchley, a monumental shift, and Elias felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. The aim had never been to humiliate the establishment, but to expand its vision. The Landscape and Law project flourished. They secured a long-term grant that allowed for more extensive, yet still non-invasive surveys across the South Downs, mapping out what appeared to be a vast network of interconnected Neolithic sites, with the King's Rest and Windover Hill as major focal points. They discovered more processional avenues, more subtle earthworks, and even through LiDAR, the faint outlines of what might have been large timber halls or enclosures near the primary monuments, places where the community might have gathered for rituals timed to the celestial events marked by the landscape. Meg, from the tavern, became an invaluable source of local contacts and historical anecdotes, her sharp memory and no-nonsense approach cutting through much of the romantic embellishment that often clung to local lore. She even organised a small village festival, the Waking of the Giant, timed to the spring equinox, featuring traditional music. Tomo Bedlam, now hailed as a folk oracle, was a star performer, storytelling and guided walks along the newly understood ancient pathways. It was a way for the community to reclaim and celebrate its deep heritage. Willem, the old shepherd, worked closely with Elias, his intimate knowledge of the Downs proving crucial in identifying subtle landscape features that even the LiDAR sometimes missed. Ancient trackways, forgotten springs, specific viewpoints that framed celestial events in unique ways. He never claimed to understand all the academic theories, but as he once told Elias, "The old stones, they feel different now, Master, like they're breathing again." One particularly exciting discovery came from a detailed analysis of soil phosphates around the King's Rest. The 7 radiating rays showed significantly higher phosphate levels, indicative of repeated concentrated human or animal activity, perhaps feasting, offerings, or ritual processions along these specific paths, further cementing their importance in the site's use. Aris Thorne, when not engaged in his own marine geophysics projects, including ongoing work at Abu Rawash, where the full scale of the Water Guardian was still being slowly unveiled, would often join Elias in Sussex. Their contrasting personalities, Elias's quiet introspection, Aris's boisterous enthusiasm, created a dynamic and productive partnership. It was Aris who pushed for the use of augmented reality apps, allowing visitors to see virtual reconstructions of the Windover Hill stone circle or the timber structures overlaid on the existing landscape, bringing the Neolithic world vividly to life. Alara Vance and Elias corresponded regularly, sharing data, insights, and the occasional frustration with academic bureaucracy. They were planning a joint symposium on archaic cosmologies, convergent patterns in global prehistory, aiming to bring together researchers from diverse fields to explore these tantalizing cross-cultural echoes. The Rosetta Stone of symbolic thought was still elusive, but the search itself was yielding profound insights into the intellectual and spiritual capabilities of early human societies. The final piece of the Sussex puzzle, or at least the next significant piece, came not from a new survey or excavation, but from the dusty archives of a local manor house. A keen-eyed postgraduate working with Elias, sifting through uncatalogued estate papers, found a crudely drawn 17th-century map of the Windover Hill area. The map, clearly made by someone with local knowledge but little formal cartographic skill, depicted the star mark not as a ruin, but as a complete circle of standing stones. And beside it, a small spidery annotation, "Ye Seven Daunces of Ye Star Plough." The Star Plough, the traditional English name for the Big Dipper, or Ursa Major. But the Pleiades were often called the Seven Sisters, or, in some traditions, associated with a celestial dance. Could this be a conflation, or a reference to another important alignment from the site? More calculations, more late nights, and there it was. From the star mark at the opposite time of year, the autumn equinox marking the end of the harvest, the Big Dipper would have appeared to pivot or dance directly around Polaris, the North Star, which itself would have been perfectly framed by a specific notch in the distant northern hills as viewed from the King's Rest entrance. The entire landscape was a celestial clock, marking not just one but multiple key points in the annual cycle. The 7 Daunces and the herdsman's hounds were part of the same intricate cosmic choreography. Elias presented these new findings at the symposium he co-organized with Alara Vance. The room was packed. Professor Finchley was in the audience, listening intently, no longer tapping his pen with dismissive impatience, but taking notes. In his concluding remarks, Elias didn't speak of definitive answers, but of unfolding questions, of the profound shared human endeavor to find meaning in the universe. Our ancestors, he said, his voice quiet but resonant, Whether they built in the chalk hills of Sussex or the floodplains of the Nile, or terraced the mountains of Guangxi, were not simply struggling for survival. They were looking up. They were mapping the stars, reading the rhythms of the earth, and encoding their wisdom into the very landscapes they inhabited, into the stories they told their children. They left us a legacy not just of monuments, but of a way of seeing, a way of belonging. Our task, as seekers of old tales, is to learn to listen again, to see with their eyes, and to rediscover the profound connections that bind us to them and to the cosmos itself. The applause was long and heartfelt. Later, Finchley approached him, a rare, almost diffident smile on his face. "Remarkable, Thorn, truly remarkable. You've made us all look up again." It was, Elias thought, the highest praise. The sleeping giant, and indeed the water guardian and the dragon's backbone were all stirring, their ancient voices joining a global chorus, reminding a modern world, often lost in its own clamour, of the enduring wisdom written in the earth and stars. The journey was endless, the whispers infinite. And Elias Thorn, the scholar who had learned to listen to the land, knew his work had only just begun. Next story 2. The dust of the Giza Plateau, a fine ochre powder that tasted of millennia, clung to Elara Vance's worn boots. It was a familiar sensation, this gritty film coating her skin, a constant companion in her pursuit of whispers from forgotten ages. But this wasn't Giza of the towering pyramids and the regal sphinx, not the Giza that drew throngs and filled textbooks. Her Giza lay a little to the northwest, near Abu Rawash, where the Nile's floodplain met the desert's edge. A liminal space where local fishermen sometimes spoke of unnatural smoothness beneath the silt, of shapes too symmetrical for the river's whims. Could a truth older than Khafre's gaze lie sleeping under these shifting sands and seasonal waters? The question had thrummed beneath Elara's skin for years, a persistent, almost heretical hum. She was 32, tall and wiry, her dark curls escaping a haphazardly tied scarf. A faint crescent scar above her left eyebrow, a memento from a tumble into a Minoan Larnax pit, lent a rakish air to her otherwise intensely focused grey eyes. Today those eyes scanned the reedy banks, the sluggish water reflecting a sky bleached by the Egyptian sun. Her current project, funded by a grant so small it felt more like a dare, was to investigate anomalies in the sediment layers here, anomalies that official Egyptology had largely dismissed as natural rock formations or wishful thinking. But Elara, whose early career had been marked by a quiet defiance of academic dogma after a significant teenage discovery was initially waved away by experts, trusted the whispers. She believed history was a palimpsest, with older, fainter narratives often obscured by the bold script of later empires. Her base was a cramped room in a nearby village, a place that smelled of baking bread, goat, and the timeless scent of the Nile. Here, among stacks of geological surveys, satellite images, and faded antiquarian maps, she felt the familiar thrum intensify. She'd come to Egypt not to retread the well-worn paths, but to listen for the silences, the gaps in the grand narrative. The local elders spoke of El Harez El Mia, the water guardian, a story dismissed by most as charming folklore, a tale of a great beast that slept beneath the waters, its form only hinted at during the lowest of Niles or the driest of droughts. "You chase shadows, Dr. Vance," a voice, dry as the desert wind, had said just last week. It was Dr. Alistair Finch, a titan in Egyptology, his silver hair impeccably combed, his Savile Row suit an incongruous sight against the backdrop of her cluttered field office during his brief, almost condescending visit. He'd built his formidable career on the established timeline of the Fourth Dynasty. The Giza Plateau has yielded its primary secrets. These anomalies are tricks of light and sediment. Nature is a clever mimic. His smile hadn't reached his eyes, those eyes that peered over spectacles perched precisely on his nose. His words, though polite, were a clear warning. Stray too far from the accepted path, and the academic wilderness awaited. Elara knew that wilderness. She'd skirted its edges before when her research into pre-dynastic water cults had been deemed too speculative for continued institutional backing. She needed local help, someone who knew the river's moods, the land's secrets beyond what any map could show. That's how she found Sameh al-Sayed, a man in his mid-40s, his face a roadmap of sun and wind, his hands calloused from years of working the felucca his father and grandfather had sailed before him. He was a man of the river, quiet, observant, his initial skepticism towards this foreign woman and her strange equipment slowly giving way to a cautious curiosity. He knew the stories of El Hares El Maya, not as academic curiosities, but as part of the land's breath. "The river keeps its secrets well, Yasit Elara," Sameh had said, his voice low, gesturing towards the shimmering expanse of water near Abu Rawash. "Sometimes it shows a glimpse. Most times it just watches." Her preliminary remote sensing data, painstakingly gathered, showed something. Not a clear outline, not yet, but a density variation, a large, elongated mass beneath several meters of silt and seasonal water that didn't quite conform to the surrounding geology. It was a long shot, a whisper against the roar of established history. But Elara Vance had always been a good listener. Her equipment was modest, a portable ground-penetrating radar unit, a coring tool, and her indefatigable laptop. The heat was a physical presence, pressing down as she and Sameh maneuvered the small, flat-bottomed boat into the shallows. Kalen, no, that was the name from her Turkish dream, her mind corrected. This was Sameh, solid and real. The lines of her previous half-formed project blurred sometimes with the present. The Turkish coast, Kadara, that was a different life, a different mystery. Here it was the Nile, ancient and implacable. Sameh skillfully poled the boat through a thicket of papyrus, the feathery heads brushing against Elara's face. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, decaying vegetation, and the faint metallic tang of the river water itself. Cicadas buzzed, a relentless, shimmering sound. "Here," Sameh said, his voice barely above a whisper, pointing to an area where the water seemed to ripple differently, the reeds growing in a subtly altered pattern. "My grandfather used to say, 'This is where the Guardian breathes.'" Elara felt a familiar prickle of anticipation, the one that always came when she was close. She cross-referenced the spot with her GPS data. It matched one of the more prominent anomalies. "All right, Sameh, let's try a core sample here." The work was slow, laborious. Driving the corer through layers of compacted silt and clay required all their strength. Finch's dismissive words echoed in her mind. Tricks of light and sediment. Was she chasing a phantom, investing her meager resources, her reputation on a fisherman's tale and a blip on a screen? The scar above her eyebrow throbbed faintly, a reminder of past tumbles, both literal and professional. But then the corer hit something. Not bedrock, something different. It wasn't the dull thud of stone, but a more resonant, almost hollow sound, followed by a grating resistance. With concerted effort, they extracted the core. Elara laid it carefully in its trough, her heart hammering. The upper layers were predictable. Dark, rich Nile silt, interspersed with layers of sand and clay, telling a story of countless floods and dry seasons. But then, near the bottom of the sample, just above the point where the core had met resistance, was a thin, distinct layer of something else. It was compacted, reddish material, almost like crushed brick or pottery, but finer, older, and embedded within a tiny, almost microscopic fleck of worked stone, not the local limestone, but something harder, darker, granite perhaps, with an edge that seemed too clean, too deliberate to be natural. "Sameh, look at this," she breathed, pointing with a trembling finger. He peered closely, his brow furrowed. "This red earth, it is not from around here, not for many lifetimes." He touched the granite fleck. "And this stone, it is like the old temples, far south." It wasn't proof, not yet, but it was more than a trick of light. It was a tangible anomaly, a whisper made solid. Over the next few days, they took more core samples, mapping out the extent of the subterranean mass. The reddish layer appeared consistently above the resistant surface, and occasionally more flecks of foreign stone, even a tiny shard of what looked like heavily weathered, man-made ceramic, too old to be dynastic. The reddish layer appeared consistently above the resistant surface, and occasionally more flecks of foreign stone, even a tiny shard of what looked like heavily weathered man-made ceramic, too old to be. The GPR scans, when recalibrated with this new ground truth data, began to resolve into a more coherent, though still frustratingly vague shape. Long, impossibly massive, with curves that hinted at a deliberate monumental form. An elongated body, perhaps? Rounded haunches? Elara worked late into the nights in her small room, the single fan stirring the oppressive heat. The village sounds, Distant laughter, the braying of a donkey, the call to prayer echoing across the fields, faded as she immersed herself in the data. She cross-referenced the alignment of the submerged mass with known predynastic celestial markers. There was a correlation, faint but persistent, with the rising of Sirius in a specific epoch, an epoch thousands of years before the accepted dating of the Giza Sphinx. Her internal conflict raged. Her academic training screamed for caution, for more data, for peer-reviewed methodology. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, Finch's voice seemed to intone in her memory. But her intuition, that gut feeling that had led her to overlooked truths before, urged her onward. This wasn't just a geological feature. This was something. The local legends, the Water Guardian. What if they weren't just stories? What if they were the echoes of a profound submerged truth, a memory passed down through countless generations, distorted by time but rooted in a genuine monumental past? She knew she needed more than core samples and GPR blips. She needed to see, or at least to get a clearer image. A proper underwater survey with side-scan sonar was beyond her current budget. She thought of Kalen in Turkey, his drone skills during that storm at Kadara. A different world, a different challenge. But the principle was the same. Find a way to see what was hidden. She decided to write a preliminary report, carefully worded, focusing on the anomalous sediment layers and the presence of foreign materials, hinting at the GPR findings without making definitive claims about a structure. She would send it to a few select journals, perhaps even to a junior colleague of Finch's she knew, someone slightly more open-minded, hoping to generate enough interest for a collaborative, better-funded survey. It was a risk. Finch could easily quash it, brand her a sensationalist, but doing nothing felt like a betrayal of the whispers she was hearing from beneath the Nile. Sama, observing her intense, almost feverish work, grew more protective. He began sharing more of the old stories, not just about El Hares El Maya, but about the first people who supposedly came to the Nile Valley when the desert was still green, who understood the river's spirit and built wonders before the pharaohs. These tales were rich with imagery of water, stars, and great stone beasts that guarded the sacred places. Alara listened, not as a folklorist cataloguing myths, but as a historian seeking corroborative echoes. One evening, as the sun bled orange and purple across the western desert, Same took her to a place a little further inland, a series of low, heavily eroded rock outcrops. "My grandmother used to bring me here," he said, his voice softer than usual. "She said this was a place where the first people prayed to the stars and the water." Among the rocks, almost invisible beneath layers of wind-blown sand, Alara found them. Petroglyphs. They were incredibly ancient, weathered almost smooth, but unmistakably man-made. Not hieroglyphs, something far older. Abstract symbols, spirals, wavy lines reminiscent of water, and a recurring motif of a lion-like creature with an elongated body, often depicted alongside star patterns. They were strikingly similar to some of the cruder symbols she'd seen on the tiny ceramic shard from the core sample. Her breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just corroboration. This was a direct link. The art style, the symbolism, it felt predynastic, profoundly old, connected to the submerged mystery in a way that sent shivers down her spine. The Water Guardian wasn't just a story. It was an icon, a memory etched in stone, both above and, she suspected, below the waterline. "Finch needs to see this," she murmured, though a part of her dreaded the thought. This was the kind of evidence that could either make her career or see her permanently relegated to the fringes. The kind of evidence that could rewrite the first chapter of Egypt itself. The decision to contact Dr. Alastair Finch directly was a gamble Alara weighed for several sleepless nights. Sending her findings to a journal was one thing, a direct confrontation with the man who embodied the institutional skepticism she fought against was another. But the petroglyphs, coupled with the increasingly coherent GPR data and the anomalous core samples, felt too significant to introduce through cautious, peer-reviewed channels that Finch could easily obstruct or delay. She needed to force his hand, or at least his attention. She compiled a concise but compelling dossier. High-resolution photographs of the petroglyphs, detailed analyses of the core samples highlighting the non-local materials, and the latest GPR imagery, carefully annotated to show the submerged anomaly's scale and suggestive form. She kept her interpretations conservative, focusing on the unexplained data rather than leaping to conclusions about a sphinx. The covering letter was brief, professional, requesting his expert opinion on these unusual findings in the Abu Rawash vicinity. Finch's reply, when it came a week later via email, was icily polite. He acknowledged the curious nature of the petroglyphs, suggesting they merited further study by specialists in rock art, but reiterated his profound skepticism regarding any large-scale submerged structure, attributing her GPR readings to complex alluvial deposits and natural limestone formations common to the region. He concluded by saying he would be in Egypt for a conference in Luxor the following month, and, if his schedule permitted, he might find time to briefly visit her site, though he cautioned her against premature or sensationalist conclusions. It was a dismissal wrapped in academic courtesy, but the mention of a potential visit was a sliver of an opening. Alara knew Finch. His curiosity, however deeply buried beneath layers of professional caution and ego, would be piqued by the petroglyphs, if not by her GPR data. He wouldn't be able to resist the chance to personally debunk her theories, or, in the unlikely event she was onto something, to be seen as the senior figure overseeing a significant find. The wait was agonizing. Alara, with Same's continued assistance, used the time to conduct more focused GPR surveys, trying to refine the image of the submerged anomaly. The form remained elusive, a ghostly giant beneath the silt, but its presence felt more undeniable with each pass. She also meticulously documented the area around the petroglyphs, searching for any further surface clues, pottery shards, worked flints, anything that might help date the rock art or link it to a specific culture. The land was stingy with its secrets, yielding little more than the desert's ubiquitous dust. Her internal conflict intensified. The cautious, academically trained part of her brain replayed Finch's warnings, urging her to stick to the verifiable, to avoid the interpretive leaps her intuition craved. What if he's right? What if it's all just wishful thinking, a collection of coincidences I've woven into a grand, illusory tapestry? The scar above her eyebrow seemed to itch. But then she would look at the images of the petroglyphs, the strange, ancient lion beast staring out from the weathered stone, and the conviction would return. This was real. This mattered. The day Finch was due to arrive, a hot, breathless Khamsin wind was blowing, whipping sand into stinging clouds. Alara felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. Same, ever stoic, simply nodded when she told him. The desert tests everyone, Yasit Alara, even the great doctors from Cairo. Finch arrived not in a dusty Land Rover, but in an air-conditioned black sedan, looking as immaculate as he had in her field office. He was accompanied by 2 junior Egyptian archaeologists from the Ministry of Antiquities, their expressions carefully neutral. Alara greeted them, trying to project a confidence she didn't entirely feel. She started with the petroglyphs. Finch examined them closely, silently, using a small magnifying glass. He made a few non-committal sounds, then straightened up. Interesting, he conceded, his tone betraying nothing. Certainly old, but their direct relevance to your GPR anomaly remains to be demonstrated, Dr. Vance. Alara then led them to the riverbank, to the area of her most promising GPR readings. She had her laptop ready, the images cued. As she explained her findings, the layers of anomalous sediment, the foreign stone flecks, the persistent shape beneath the silt, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the murky water. The 2 junior archaeologists exchanged glances. Alluvial deposits, Dr. Vance, Finch said finally, his voice firm. The Nile is a powerful sculptor. It moves mountains of silt, carves channels, creates phantom shapes. These readings, while intriguing from a geological perspective, do not, I'm afraid, suggest a man-made structure of any significance, certainly not on the scale you seem to imply. He gestured vaguely towards Giza in the distance. The ancient Egyptians built in stone on stable ground, Dr. Vance, not in swamps. Alara felt a flush of frustration. But the petroglyphs, Dr. Finch, the symbolism? The local legends speak of a water guardian. Finch gave a small dismissive wave of his hand. Folklore is a charming diversion, not archaeological evidence. As for the petroglyphs, their dating is uncertain. They could be millennia older or younger than whatever lies beneath that mud. A coincidental proximity. He turned to his companions. I think we've seen enough. An interesting exercise in local geology, Dr. Vance, but I see no grounds for any significant archaeological intervention here. It was a public, unequivocal dismissal. The two junior archaeologists, who had perhaps harboured a flicker of curiosity, now looked down, their expressions carefully blank. Elara felt a cold wave of despair wash over her. This was it, her last chance, and Finch had snuffed it out with a few patronising words. The whispers from beneath the Nile seemed to fade, drowned out by the weight of official pronouncement. Same, who had stood silently by his boat, watched Finch's party depart. He looked at Elara's dejected face. "The river is patient, you sit," he said quietly. "It holds its truth. Sometimes men with loud voices cannot hear it." His words, simple and profound, struck a chord. Finch's dismissal hurt. It was a significant setback, but it wasn't the end. The evidence was still there. The petroglyphs, the core samples, the GPR readings, they were real. And Same was right. The river was patient. And so, Elara resolved, would she be? She would find another way. The Water Guardian, if it existed, had waited for millennia. It could wait a little longer for her. The weeks following Dr. Finch's visit were a blur of quiet persistence for Elara. His dismissal had effectively closed the door on any immediate institutional support, and the memory of his condescending pronouncements, an interesting exercise in local geology, stung like the Kamsin winds. Yet, Same's quiet wisdom had taken root. The river was patient, and Elara, fueled by a stubborn conviction that was part scientific curiosity and part intuitive faith, resolved to be the same. She couldn't afford a large-scale survey, but she could refine what she had, seek smaller independent grants, perhaps connect with geophysicists outside Finch's immediate sphere of influence. She focused on the petroglyphs. If she could establish a more definitive link between their iconography and the GPR anomaly, or at least a more precise dating for the rock art, it might force a re-evaluation. She spent days meticulously tracing the faded carvings, using advanced photographic techniques like reflectance transformation imaging, RTI, with equipment she borrowed from a sympathetic, albeit junior, contact at the American Research Center in Egypt. The RTI scans revealed details invisible to the naked eye. Faint tool marks, overlaps in the carvings suggesting different phases of creation, and even tinier, almost microscopic symbols embedded within the larger designs. One recurring symbol, previously obscured, emerged with startling clarity, a circle with 7 rays, often positioned above the elongated lion-like beast, near a cluster of dots that Elara began to suspect represented the Pleiades. This wasn't just generic star worship, this was specific, sophisticated astronomical symbolism. The Pleiades held significance for agricultural cycles in many ancient cultures, often linked to rainfall and the flooding of rivers. The 7 rays, could they represent the 7 stars of the Pleiades themselves, or perhaps something else, a sacred number? Meanwhile, Same, using his intricate knowledge of the river's microcurrents and sediment patterns, helped Elara identify areas where the silt deposition might be thinnest over the anomaly, or where older, deeper layers might be closer to the surface. He spoke of seasons, decades past, when the Nile ran unusually low, exposing mudflats and sandbanks not seen for generations. Sometimes, he'd say, squinting at the water, the old bones of the river show themselves. Then the water rises and they sleep again. His words sparked an idea. What if a significant, prolonged drought, or an unusual flood pattern in the distant past, had briefly exposed a portion of a massive structure, long enough for it to be seen, to become legend, before being resubmerged? The reddish sediment layer she'd found in the cores, what if that was the signature of such an event? A massive influx of iron-rich earth washed down from the Ethiopian highlands during an exceptional flood, burying whatever lay beneath. Elara began to research paleoclimatology data for the region, digging into studies of ancient Nile flood levels. There were indeed periods in the early Holocene, long before the dynastic Egyptians, when the Nile experienced wild Nile phases, with catastrophic floods and drastically fluctuating levels, and there were also documented mega-droughts. If a monumental structure had been built during a drier period, a subsequent wild Nile phase could easily have buried it, or a mega-drought millennia later could have briefly re-exposed it, seeding the legends. One afternoon, while reviewing old British survey maps from the 19th century at a dusty archive in Cairo, Elara found a curious annotation. On a detailed chart of the Abu Rawash area, a surveyor had noted unusual regularized bank formation, possibly ancient, visible at extreme low Nile 1878. It was a tiny note, almost a footnote, dismissed by later cartographers. But 1878, Alara cross-referenced it. It was a year of exceptionally severe drought in the region. Her heart quickened. This wasn't just folklore. This was a documented observation, however fleeting, by a trained surveyor, aligning with Same's ancestral memory of the river revealing its old bones. The regularized bank formation. Could that have been the partially exposed flank of her submerged anomaly? She needed to talk to Finch again. Not to plead, but to present this new confluence of evidence. The refined petroglyph analysis with its specific astronomical symbolism, the paleoclimatology data suggesting windows of exposure or burial, and now a historical surveyor's note. It was still circumstantial, but the pattern was becoming too strong to ignore, too intricate to be mere coincidence. The Luxor conference, where Finch was a keynote speaker, was her chance. It was a long shot to get an impromptu meeting, let alone change his mind, but she had to try. She booked a cheap train ticket, her dossier of new evidence clutched in her hand like a talisman. The conference hall was a stark contrast to the timeless rhythms of the Nile, air-conditioned to a chill, filled with the murmur of academics from around the world. Alara felt out of place in her practical field attire amidst the suits and scholarly gowns. Finch, when she finally managed to corner him during a coffee break, looked down his nose at her, his expression one of weary impatience. "Dr. Vance," he said, his voice cool, "I thought we had concluded our discussion regarding Abu Rawash." "New evidence has come to light, Dr. Finch," Alara said, trying to keep her voice steady. She quickly outlined the RTI findings on the petroglyphs, the Pleiades connection, the surveyor's note from 1878. The patterns, the astronomical alignments, the historical observation, it all points to something more than alluvial deposits. Finch listened, tapping his pen against his chin, a habit Alara now recognized as a sign of his impending critique. Patterns can be found anywhere if one looks hard enough, Dr. Vance. Pareidolia is a common pitfall in our field. As for a 19th century surveyor's note, anecdotal at best, subject to the biases and limited understanding of the time. He sighed, a theatrical sound of intellectual burden. "I admire your persistence, truly, but you are constructing a narrative from disparate, highly speculative threads. The ministry, and indeed the serious academic community, requires something far more substantial before sanctioning any further investigation into what remains, in all probability, a natural feature." His tone was final, a door politely but firmly shut. Alara felt the familiar sting of dismissal, but this time something else mingled with it, a cold, hard anger. It wasn't just about her theory anymore. It was about the deliberate blindness, the refusal to even consider that the established narrative might be incomplete. She looked him in the eye. "With all due respect, Dr. Finch," she said, her voice low but clear, "absence of overwhelming proof is not proof of absence, and sometimes the most substantial truths are found by looking where no one else has bothered or dared to look." She turned and walked away, leaving him tapping his pen, a faint frown creasing his brow. She hadn't changed his mind, but perhaps, just perhaps, she had planted a seed of doubt, or at least signalled that she wasn't going away. The whispers from Abu Rawash were growing louder, and Alara Vance was determined to make the world listen. Back at Abu Rawash, the disappointment from the Luxor encounter settled heavily on Alara. Finch's unwavering skepticism felt like a stone wall, and the path to any officially sanctioned large-scale investigation seemed hopelessly blocked. Her meagre funds were dwindling. She sat by the Nile as dusk painted the sky in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange, the water a silken ribbon reflecting the fading light. Same, sensing her mood, sat with her in companionable silence, mending a fishing net, the rhythmic flick of his shuttle a soothing counterpoint to the turmoil in her mind. "The great doctor?" He did not believe. Same asked eventually, not looking up from his work. Alara sighed. "He believes what the books have always told him, Sama. It's hard to see a new path when the old one is so well trodden." Same nodded slowly. "The old path is safe. But the river, it changes its course sometimes, makes new paths. The old ones are forgotten until someone with keen eyes finds them again." He paused, then looked directly at her. "Your eyes are keen, you sit, Alara." His simple faith was a balm. He didn't need complex theories or academic validation. He knew the river, he knew its stories, and he saw the truth in her quest. It was Kalen in Turkey all over again, the local wisdom that science often overlooked. That night, an idea born of desperation and a refusal to yield began to form. If official channels were closed, she needed to create a wave of interest so strong it couldn't be ignored. She couldn't fund a major underwater excavation, but perhaps she could fund a highly targeted, non-invasive sonar survey, something more sophisticated than her portable GPR. She thought of an old university colleague, now working for a private marine survey company, someone who owed her a favor. It would be expensive, even with a discount, and would consume the last of her personal savings. But what was the alternative? To walk away? To let the Water Guardian sleep undisturbed, its secrets lost to Finch's dogma? The decision made, a renewed energy coursed through her. She spent the next few weeks preparing meticulously, identifying the 3 most promising zones over the anomaly based on her GPR data and Same's knowledge of the riverbed. She corresponded with her colleague, Dr. Aris Thorne, a geophysicist with a maverick streak similar to her own. Thorne was intrigued by her data, especially the historical surveyor's note and the petroglyph connections. He agreed to bring a small, high-resolution side-scan sonar unit, ostensibly for a geological survey of Nile sediment transport, a cover that might bypass immediate ministry scrutiny for a short-term, privately funded project. The arrival of Thorne and his equipment was a clandestine affair, conducted under the pretext of testing new survey technology. Finch, Alara knew, had ears everywhere, and the less official attention they drew initially, the better. Same, with his felucca, proved invaluable, his knowledge of the river's currents and submerged hazards, ensuring the delicate sonar towfish could be deployed safely and precisely over the target zones. The sonar began to paint a picture on Thorne's laptop, line by line, transforming acoustic echoes into a visual representation of the riverbed and what lay beneath. The first 2 zones yielded intriguing, but still ambiguous results. Large, smooth areas, unnatural undulations in the bedrock, but nothing definitively artificial. Alara's hope began to fray. Was Finch right after all? Then, as they surveyed the 3rd zone, the one Same had always insisted was the heart of the Water Guardian, the sonar image began to change. A long, remarkably straight line emerged from the digital noise, then another, parallel to it. More lines appeared, intersecting at right angles, and then a massive curved shape, impossibly smooth and symmetrical, began to resolve on the screen. It was enormous, easily over 100 meters long, with a distinct raised section at one end, like a head or platform, and what looked like paws, or at least massive, rounded protrusions in the correct anatomical position for the forelimbs of a colossal recumbent animal. Alara stared, her breath catching in her throat. Thorne let out a low whistle. "Well, Vance, that's no alluvial deposit. That has structure, intentional structure." The image was still blurred by layers of silt, but the underlying form was undeniable. It was leonine, sphinx-like, but its scale, its clear orientation towards the east, and its apparent integration with the subtle contours of the riverbed suggested an artistry and an antiquity that was breathtaking. "It's him," Alara whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "It's the Water Guardian." Same, looking over her shoulder at the screen, simply nodded, a slow, knowing smile spreading across his face. He was just sleeping. They worked through the night, conducting multiple passes, generating a composite image of stunning clarity. The structure was undeniably artificial, a colossal, sphinx-like effigy, far larger than the Giza Sphinx, and clearly oriented along ancient astronomical lines. The implications were staggering. This predated the pyramids, possibly by millennia. It would rewrite the very origins of monumental architecture in Egypt, perhaps the world. Alara knew this was the extraordinary evidence Finch had demanded. This was undeniable. The next step was to present it, not just to the academic world, but to the public. The story of the Water Guardian of Abu Rawash deserved to be told. The decision of how and where to reveal their findings weighed heavily on Alara. A standard academic paper would take months, even years, to go through peer review, and Finch could still exert considerable influence to delay or discredit it. The Giza conference was over. She needed a platform that was both credible and immediate, one that could bypass the usual gatekeepers. Aris Thorne, her geophysicist colleague, had connections with a highly respected international science journal known for its rapid publication of groundbreaking, well-vetted discoveries. It was still a rigorous process, but one focused on the data's integrity rather than academic politics. They worked feverishly for weeks, Alara writing the main body of the paper, detailing the historical context, the petroglyph connections, the core sample analyses, and the GPR groundwork. Thorne contributed the technical sections on the side-scan sonar methodology and data processing, his reputation lending significant weight to the findings. Same's contributions, his ancestral knowledge, his guidance on the river, his eyewitness account of the survey, were woven throughout, credited as invaluable local expertise. The sonar images themselves were the centerpiece, stark, undeniable evidence of a colossal, symmetrical, artificial structure lying beneath the Nile's silt at Abu Rawash. The paper was submitted under a title that was both scientifically accurate and evocatively intriguing. A colossal submerged anthropomorphic monument at Abu Rawash, evidence for predynastic megalithic architecture on the Nile floodplain. The journal's review process was intense. Anonymous experts pored over every detail, every claim, every image. Alara and Thorne responded to queries, clarified data points, and defended their interpretations. Finch, Alara learned through back channels, was not one of the primary reviewers, though his known skepticism likely informed some of the more pointed questions. But the sonar data was too compelling. The images, rigorously analysed by independent geophysicists consulted by the journal, held up. During this anxious waiting period, a minor, almost serendipitous event occurred. A small, localised dredging operation by the Ministry of Irrigation, aimed at clearing a blocked canal intake a few kilometres downstream from Alara's survey site, but geologically connected by ancient flood patterns, unexpectedly brought up a large, heavily encrusted block of granite. It was clearly worked, part of a much larger structure, and its style was unlike typical dynastic masonry. It was deemed an unusual find of indeterminate age, and quietly stored away, but news of it reached Alara via a sympathetic junior official at the ministry, who had seen her preliminary, privately circulated notes on the foreign stone flecks in her core samples. The granite type matched. It was another small piece, but it fit. Then the email arrived. The paper was accepted. It would be fast-tracked for online publication, to be followed by inclusion in their print edition. The journal understood the magnitude of the discovery and the public interest it would generate. The night before the paper was due to go live online, Alara, Thorne, and Sama sat by the Nile, the stars blazing with an almost painful intensity in the clear desert sky. The air was still, the only sound the gentle lapping of water against the bank. "Tomorrow," Alara said, her voice filled with a mixture of trepidation and triumph, "the world will know about him." Sama looked out at the dark water, a faint smile on his lips. He has been patient. He knows his time. The publication of their paper, complete with the stunning sonar imagery, sent shockwaves through the archaeological world and beyond. The Abu Rawash anomaly, or more popularly, the Nile Sphinx, became an instant global sensation. News outlets picked up the story, splashing the sonar images across front pages and websites. Documentaries were hastily commissioned. The journal's site nearly crashed from the traffic. Dr. Alastair Finch, caught off guard, was initially silent. When finally pressed by journalists, he issued a terse statement acknowledging the intriguing sonar data, but emphasizing the need for extensive, direct archaeological excavation and rigorous C14 dating, before any definitive conclusions about the structure's age or nature could be drawn. He carefully avoided mentioning his previous dismissals of Alara's work, but the subtext was clear. He remained the gatekeeper of legitimate interpretation. The Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities, faced with overwhelming public interest and the undeniable quality of the sonar evidence, announced it would form a special committee to review the findings and consider a preliminary, non-invasive survey, possibly involving underwater remotely operated vehicles, ROVs. They invited Alara and Thorne to present their findings directly to the committee. Same, at Alara's insistence, was also invited as a local consultant. The committee meeting was held in a grand wood-panelled room in Cairo, a world away from the dusty banks of Abu Rawash. Finch was there, naturally, a prominent member of the committee. Alara, flanked by Thorn and a quietly dignified Sameh, presented their case. She didn't focus on theories of lost civilizations or speculative timelines. She stuck to the data, the petroglyphs and their astronomical alignments, the core samples with their foreign inclusions, the 19th century surveyor's note, the recently dredged granite block, and, most powerfully, the sonar imagery that showed the colossal symmetrical form of the Water Guardian. She spoke of the local legends not as proof, but as enduring cultural memory that deserved respect and investigation. She highlighted Sameh's invaluable contribution, emphasizing the importance of integrating local knowledge with scientific methodology. When she finished, there was a moment of silence. Then the questions began, sharp, probing, skeptical, but also tinged with a new, undeniable curiosity. Finch himself asked several technical questions about the sonar calibration and sediment density, his tone less dismissive now, more cautious, almost grudgingly respectful of the data's quality, if not her broader interpretations. The climax of the meeting came not from Alara, but from an unexpected quarter. A very senior, internationally respected Egyptian geologist on the committee, who had been silent throughout, finally spoke. "Dr. Vance, Dr. Thorn," he said, his voice resonant. "For years we have seen certain irregularities in the deep sediment strata of the Abu Rawash floodplain. We attributed them to unusual paleo-channel activity. However, your sonar data, particularly the clear geometric forms and the sheer scale of this anomaly, forces a re-evaluation." He paused, looking directly at Finch, then around the table. "The possibility of a significant pre-dynastic megalithic structure in this location can no longer be summarily dismissed. I, for one, support a carefully planned ministry-led exploratory survey." His words from such an authoritative source shifted the room's atmosphere. Other committee members, previously hesitant, began to voice support for further investigation. Finch, visibly taken aback by the geologist's pronouncement, offered no further objections, merely stating that any future work must adhere to the strictest scientific protocols. The committee's official recommendation, issued a week later, was for a phased exploratory project, beginning with advanced ROV surveys and targeted core drilling to obtain datable material directly from the structure itself. Alara, Thorn and Sameh were invited to be part of the advisory team. It wasn't full vindication, not yet. The true nature and age of the Water Guardian were still mysteries locked beneath the silt, but it was a monumental step. The door that Finch had tried to keep shut was now, undeniably, open. Standing once more on the banks of the Nile at Abu Rawash with Sameh, Alara watched the sunset. The water glowed, a path of liquid gold leading towards the submerged anomaly. The whispers were no longer just hers, they were echoing around the world. "He is waking up! Yes, sit," Sameh said, a smile in his voice. Alara nodded, a deep sense of peace settling over her, a peace mixed with the thrilling anticipation of the discoveries yet to come. The journey had been fraught with skepticism, professional risk, and moments of profound doubt. But by listening to the land, to its forgotten stories, and to the quiet insistence of her own intuition, she had helped give voice to a secret the Nile had kept for millennia. The official history books might indeed be incomplete, she thought, but they were not immutable. And the enduring human quest for knowledge, for connection to the deepest roots of our past, was a current as powerful and persistent as the great river itself. The Water Guardian had waited. Now its story would finally begin to unfold. The months that followed were a whirlwind of preparation, planning and navigating the complex bureaucracy of a major international archaeological project. Alara found herself in countless meetings, poring over logistical charts and collaborating with a diverse team of experts, geophysicists, marine archaeologists, engineers, and Egyptologists, some of whom had, not long ago, viewed her theories with polite skepticism. Dr. Finch, true to his word, maintained a professional, if distant, involvement, ensuring protocols were strictly adhered to, his presence a constant reminder of the academic tightrope Alara still walked. He was no longer an outright antagonist, but a watchful critic, waiting to see if the tangible evidence would truly support the extraordinary implications of the sonar images. Sameh became an indispensable part of the team on the ground, his knowledge of the river's capricious moods and the local terrain, proving invaluable during the setup of the dive support barges and survey equipment. He moved with a quiet dignity among the international experts, his observations often cutting through complex technical jargon to offer simple, practical solutions. Many of the team members, initially perhaps seeing him as just a local boatman, soon came to respect his profound understanding of the Abu Rawash environment. He was the living link to the place, the institutional memory that predated any scientific instrument. Alara's internal conflict, the tension between her intuitive leaps and her academic rigor, found a new equilibrium. The sonar had validated her intuition, but now the rigor was paramount. Every step of the ROV survey and core drilling plan was scrutinized. She knew the world was watching, and any misstep would be seized upon by those still eager to dismiss the Water Guardian as a mirage. The scar above her eyebrow no longer itched with self-doubt. It felt more like a badge of honor, a reminder of the persistence required to challenge entrenched beliefs. The ROV, remotely operated vehicle survey, was the first crucial test. Equipped with high-definition cameras, powerful lights, and manipulator arms, the small submersible was deployed from a specially equipped barge anchored precisely over the anomaly. Elara, Thorn, Same, and a select group from the Ministry Committee gathered in the onboard control room, watching the live video feed on a bank of monitors. The descent through the murky Nile water was tense. The first images were just swirling silt, the ROV's thrusters stirring up the riverbed. Then, as the vehicle neared the depth indicated by the sonar, a vast shadowy form began to emerge from the gloom. It was colossal, far larger than the initial sonar blips could fully convey. The ROV's lights played across a surface that was not natural rock, but clearly worked stone, covered in a thick layer of concretion and silt, yet unmistakably shaped. A collective gasp went through the control room. The ROV moved slowly along what appeared to be a massive flank. The surface was heavily eroded, but here and there patches of smoother, possibly dressed stone were visible. Then the camera focused on a colossal rounded curve, one of the paws hinted at in the sonar. It was undeniably artificial, shaped with a powerful, deliberate artistry. Further along they found a section of what looked like a massive, recumbent leonine shoulder, the sheer scale of it dwarfing the ROV. There were no intricate carvings visible yet, no inscriptions. The surface was too degraded, too obscured. But the form, the symmetry, the sheer monumental presence, it was breathtaking. Alara felt tears prick her eyes again, not of relief this time, but of profound awe. This was it. The Water Guardian, in all its submerged, silent majesty. Finch, watching from the back of the control room, was uncharacteristically silent, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Even he could not deny what was appearing on the screens. The next phase involved targeted core drilling, using a specialized rig to extract samples directly from the structure itself, aiming for areas protected from the worst of the erosion, hoping to find datable organic material trapped within the stonework or beneath it. This was an even more delicate operation. Alara and Thorn had identified several key points based on the ROV footage and the original sonar data. The first few cores yielded mostly stone, ancient weathered limestone, and in one section, granite, confirming the earlier dredged block. Then, from a core drilled deep at the juncture of the paw and the main body, came something else. Trapped between two massive, tightly fitted blocks, preserved in an anaerobic layer of clay, was a small fragment of what looked like reed matting, or perhaps a piece of wooden dowel used in construction. It was rushed to the lab for C-14 dating. The wait for the results was another period of intense anxiety. The visual evidence was stunning, but a definitive date was crucial to understanding the Water Guardian's place in history. If it was Fourth Dynasty, it was a new, colossal sphinx. If it was older, as Alara suspected, it would rewrite everything. During this interlude, Alara found herself spending more time with Same, not just discussing the project, but learning more about the village, its rhythms, its deeper connection to the river. He showed her how the old men still read the patterns of migratory birds to predict the intensity of the summer heat, how the women used specific Nile clays for healing poultices, knowledge passed down through uncounted generations. These weren't just quaint customs. They were an unbroken chain of observation and adaptation, a different kind of science, one that resonated deeply with Alara's own approach to the past. She realized that her discovery wasn't just about unearthing a monument. It was about honoring the enduring wisdom of the people who had lived alongside it, who had kept its memory alive in their stories, even when the world had forgotten. The C-14 results arrived on a quiet, cool morning. Alara opened the email with trembling hands. Thorn and Sammer stood beside her. She scanned the report, her eyes finding the crucial lines. The reed matting, the organic material trapped within the Water Guardian's core. The date was 7500 plus 200 years BP before present, roughly 5500 BCE, 3000 years before the Giza Sphinx, 3000 years before the first pharaohs of a unified Egypt. It was early pre-dynastic, a time when the Sahara was wetter, when settled communities were just beginning to flourish along the Nile, a period previously thought incapable of producing such monumental architecture. Alara looked up, her face pale, then slowly breaking into a radiant smile. "They did it," she whispered. "The first people, they really did it." Thorn let out a whoop of joy. Sammer simply placed a hand on her shoulder, his eyes shining. "The river remembers," he said softly, "and now the world will remember too." The official announcement of the dating, combined with the ROV footage, was a global event. It didn't just rewrite Egyptian history, it pushed back the timeline for megalithic construction itself, suggesting a level of societal organization and engineering skill in pre-dynastic Nile Valley cultures far beyond what had ever been imagined. Theories abounded. Was this the work of a lost civilization? What was its purpose? How was it built? Dr. Finch, when confronted with the C-14 dates, made a public statement. It was a carefully worded masterpiece of academic recalibration. He acknowledged the startling and scientifically robust dating, praised the diligent work of Dr. Vance and her team, and called for a new era of research into Egypt's deep pre-dynastic past. He didn't apologize for his earlier skepticism, but his tone was one of a man forced by undeniable evidence to expand his worldview. For Alara, it was enough. The truth of the Water Guardian was finally taking its rightful place. The project at Abu Rawash would continue for years, decades perhaps. The full excavation and conservation of such a colossal submerged monument would be an unprecedented undertaking. But the first, crucial step had been taken. A voice from the dawn of Egyptian civilization, long silenced by silt and skepticism, was beginning to speak. Alara Vance stood on the deck of the research barge, the Egyptian sun warm on her face. Below, the ROV was continuing its meticulous survey, mapping the contours of the silent giant. She thought of the journey, the initial whispers of folklore, the painstaking gathering of data, the plea of institutional resistance, the thrill of discovery, the quiet wisdom of Sameh, the unwavering support of Thorn. She thought of the medieval tavern, its chaotic storytelling a different kind of archive, of Nefertiti, her power and mystery echoing through millennia, of the Longji terraces, a testament to human harmony with the land. All different stories, yet all connected by the enduring human drive to create, to remember, to understand. The Water Guardian of Abu Rawash was more than just a monument. It was a symbol of that drive, a reminder that history is a vast, largely unexplored ocean, and that its greatest secrets often lie waiting in the depths for those with the courage and patience to seek them out. The scar above her eyebrow no longer felt like a mark of past stumbles, but a compass point, always oriented towards the next discovery, the next whisper from the past waiting to be heard. The river flowed on, carrying its ancient secrets, but now at least one of them was beginning to share its story with the world.